February 24, 1986. Van Nuys, Los Angeles. It was an ordinary Monday afternoon when 29-year-old electrical engineer John Ruetten finished work and drove back to the apartment he shared with his wife, Sherri Rasmussen. They had been married for exactly 3 months and were just beginning what everyone believed would be a long, happy life together. As John walked up the stairs toward their second-floor apartment, something immediately felt wrong. The front door was slightly open. Sherri was always careful about locking the door. Thinking perhaps she had stepped out or forgotten to close it properly, John pushed the door open. The scene inside would haunt him forever. Furniture was overturned. Drawers had been pulled open. The apartment looked as though a violent struggle had taken place. Then John saw Sherri. She was lying on the living room floor in a pool of blood. Her face and body showed signs of a brutal assault. He rushed toward her, desperately hoping she was still alive, but it was already too late. Within minutes, police officers, detectives, and paramedics filled the apartment. Investigators began documenting every detail of what appeared to be a violent burglary gone wrong. Sherri Rasmussen had suffered severe injuries during the attack. She had been beaten repeatedly. She had also been shot multiple times. Investigators noticed injuries on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought desperately to defend herself. Despite the violence, one detail puzzled investigators. Sherri's wedding ring was still on her finger. Many burglaries involved stolen jewelry, yet one of the most valuable personal items had been left untouched. Still, detectives believed the intruders had likely panicked during the confrontation and fled before taking everything they intended to steal. That conclusion shaped the investigation from the very first day. The case was officially treated as a burglary that had turned into murder. As investigators continued searching the apartment, they recovered several important pieces of physical evidence. There were signs that the killer had struggled closely with Sherri. Bloodstains covered different areas of the living room. There were fingerprints that could not immediately be identified. Investigators also collected biological evidence from the crime scene, preserving it according to forensic procedures available in 1986. At the time, however, DNA testing was still in its infancy. The technology simply did not exist to identify a suspect using such evidence. The collected samples were stored away. No one realized they would become the key to solving the case decades later. As detectives questioned friends and relatives, they learned more about Sherri Rasmussen. She was known as intelligent, hardworking, and compassionate. Friends described her as someone who loved sports, enjoyed helping others, and had recently married the man she loved. There appeared to be no enemies, no threats, no obvious motive for someone to murder her. Attention quickly shifted toward the possibility that strangers had entered the apartment. Investigators believed burglars had surprised Sherri while she was home alone. According to that theory, she resisted the intruders. A violent struggle followed, and she was ultimately killed before the attackers escaped. For years, this explanation became the official version of events. But not everyone believed it. One person refused to accept the burglary theory from the very beginning. Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, as he reviewed the circumstances surrounding his daughter's death. Certain details troubled him deeply. Why would burglars leave valuable jewelry behind? Why had the attack seemed so personal and so violent? And why did some details not fit the pattern of an ordinary robbery? Nels believed investigators were looking in the wrong direction. He told detectives that someone connected to John's past deserved much closer scrutiny. He repeatedly mentioned one specific name, Stephanie Lazarus. Years before marrying Sherri, John Ruetten had been in a romantic relationship with Lazarus. Although the relationship had ended, Nels believed she had never truly accepted that John had moved on. He urged investigators to interview her thoroughly. He wrote letters. He requested meetings. Again and again he insisted the investigation should focus on that lead. Detectives listened, but they did not pursue it as a primary theory. Instead, they remained convinced the evidence pointed toward a burglary. As months passed, the investigation slowed. No suspect was identified. No arrests were made. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen quietly became another unsolved case inside the files of the Los Angeles Police Department. Years turned into decades. The evidence remained locked away. The apartment where the tragedy occurred was eventually occupied by someone else. Life moved on for nearly everyone involved, except for one father. Nels Rasmussen never stopped searching for answers. He never stopped reminding investigators that he believed they already knew the killer's name. For more than 20 years, his warnings were ignored. What nobody realized was that the woman whose name he had repeatedly given police continued, wearing an LAPD badge every single day, working inside the very department responsible for solving his daughter's murder. And in a laboratory evidence room, one forgotten DNA sample waited silently for the technology that would finally reveal the truth. For the next several years, the investigation barely moved. Every lead detectives received eventually reached the same dead end. No murder weapon was ever recovered. No eyewitness identified a suspect. No fingerprints found at the apartment matched anyone in the criminal database. To the Los Angeles Police Department, Sherri Rasmussen's death remained a tragic burglary that had gone wrong. But inside the Rasmussen family, that explanation never made sense. Nels Rasmussen continued asking the same question over and over. If this was a burglary, why was Sherri's wedding ring still on her finger? Professional burglars usually stole jewelry before leaving. Yet one of the most valuable items in the apartment had been untouched. To Nels, it suggested something very different. He believed the killer had come for Sherri, not for money. Again and again he contacted investigators. He wrote letters. He requested meetings. And every time, he repeated the same name. Stephanie Lazarus. Years before John Ruetten met Sherri, he had dated Lazarus. The relationship eventually ended. John later fell in love with Sherri Rasmussen. The couple married in November 1985 and started a new life together. According to family members, Lazarus had known about the marriage. Nels believed investigators should carefully examine whether jealousy could have been a motive. But detectives never treated Lazarus as a primary suspect. One reason was her profession. She was an officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. Over the years, she continued building her career inside the department. She worked different assignments, earned promotions, and gained the respect of many colleagues. While the Rasmussen family searched for answers, the woman they suspected continued reporting for duty wearing an LAPD badge. Meanwhile, forensic science was changing. During the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, DNA technology advanced rapidly. Evidence that once seemed impossible to analyze suddenly became valuable. Cold cases across America were being reopened because biological evidence collected years, earlier could finally identify suspects. Eventually, detectives decided to review Sherri Rasmussen's unsolved murder once again. The cold case unit carefully removed the old evidence from storage. Investigators examined every photograph, every report, every witness statement, every piece of preserved forensic evidence. Among those items was biological material collected during the original investigation. Modern laboratory testing successfully developed a DNA profile from that evidence. The results immediately changed the direction of the case. The DNA did not belong to Sherri Rasmussen. It did not belong to John Ruetten either. That meant someone else had left biological evidence during the violent struggle inside the department. For the first time in more than 20 years, detectives had a scientific lead. As investigators reviewed the old case files, something quickly caught their attention. For decades, Nels Rasmussen had repeatedly identified Stephanie Lazarus as someone who deserved further investigation. Why had that lead never been fully explored? Detectives decided to quietly examine her background once again. Because Lazarus was still employed by LAPD, investigators had to proceed carefully. If she learned she had become a suspect, important evidence might disappear forever. The investigation remained completely confidential. Only a small group of detectives knew what was happening. The biggest challenge remained obtaining her DNA legally. Without a DNA comparison, prosecutors would never have enough evidence to file murder charges. Investigators could not simply ask her for a sample. They needed another way, so they began surveillance. For days, detectives discreetly watched Lazarus's daily routine. They followed her movements without attracting attention. Every stop, every meeting, every coffee break, everything was documented. Then one ordinary shopping trip created the opportunity they had been waiting for. Stephanie Lazarus visited a Costco store. After finishing a drink, she threw the disposable cup into a public trash bin before walking away. The surveillance team acted immediately. Detectives recovered the discarded cup. Because it had been abandoned in public, investigators were legally permitted to collect it. The cup was carefully packaged and sent directly to the crime laboratory. Everyone involved understood the importance of what would happen next. If the DNA from that cup matched the DNA preserved from Sherri Rasmussen's murder scene, one of California's most famous cold cases would change forever. More importantly, it would mean that for over 2 decades, the person suspected of killing Sherri Rasmussen had continued working inside the very police department responsible for investigating her murder. The laboratory examination began, and detectives waited anxiously for the phone call that could finally answer a question first class. On February 24, 1986, when the laboratory completed its DNA comparison, detectives received the answer they had waited more than 23 years to hear. The DNA recovered from the crime scene in 1986 matched the DNA collected from Stephanie Lazarus's discarded drink cup. The result changed everything. For the first time, investigators had scientific evidence connecting an active LAPD detective to the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. But detectives knew a DNA match alone would not be enough. They needed Lazarus to speak. They wanted to observe how she reacted when confronted with questions about a murder she believed had been forgotten decades earlier. Instead of arresting her immediately, investigators carefully planned an undercover operation. The goal was simple: bring Stephanie Lazarus into a controlled interview room without revealing that she was the suspect. Detectives told her they needed her assistance regarding an unrelated investigation involving artwork. Believing she was simply helping another police inquiry, Lazarus agreed to meet with investigators at LAPD headquarters in June 2009. She entered the interview room calmly. At first, the conversation focused on routine topics. Investigators spoke casually, making sure she felt comfortable. Then the questions slowly changed direction. One detective unexpectedly mentioned the name John Ruetten. For the first time, Lazarus appeared surprised. She admitted she had known him years earlier. Investigators continued asking about their relationship. She acknowledged that they had once dated but insisted it had ended long ago. The detectives then mentioned another name, Sherri Rasmussen. The atmosphere inside the room changed immediately. Lazarus became noticeably uncomfortable. She shifted in her chair. Her answers became shorter. Sometimes she avoided answering directly. Investigators calmly continued presenting information from the original investigation. They explained that new forensic technology had allowed detectives to review evidence collected in 1986. Without revealing every detail, they made it clear they possessed powerful scientific evidence. As the interview continued, Lazarus repeatedly denied killing Sherri Rasmussen. She suggested investigators were making assumptions. When detectives asked about DNA evidence, she appeared increasingly defensive. Rather than giving clear explanations, she often answered questions with questions of her own. Experienced investigators carefully observed every reaction. Although the interview itself was not a confession, detectives believed her behavior was significant. More importantly, the DNA evidence remained undeniable. Once the interview ended, officers moved in. Outside the interview room, Stephanie Lazarus was placed under arrest for the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. The news shocked the Los Angeles Police Department. Many officers had worked alongside Lazarus for years. Some could hardly believe that one of their own had become the prime suspect in a murder that had remained unsolved for more than 2 decades. National media quickly picked up the story. Headlines across America reported that an LAPD detective had been arrested in a cold case she had allegedly escaped for 23 years. For Sherri Rasmussen's family, the arrest was emotional. Nels Rasmussen had spent more than 2 decades insisting detectives investigate Stephanie Lazarus. Now, science had confirmed what he had believed since 1986. The investigation moved toward trial. Prosecutors argued that jealousy had been the motive. According to their case, Lazarus had never accepted that her former boyfriend had married someone else. They alleged that she confronted Sherri inside the apartment, a violent struggle followed, and Sherri was beaten before being fatally shot. Defense attorneys challenged the prosecution's theory and argued that the evidence did not prove premeditated murder. However, prosecutors relied heavily on the DNA evidence, crime scene analysis, and the inconsistencies revealed during Lazarus's interview. The jury carefully reviewed weeks of testimony. Experts explained the forensic evidence. Investigators described how the cold case had been reopened. Jurors also watched portions of Lazarus's recorded police interview. After deliberating, the jury reached its decision. Stephanie Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. More than 23 years after Sherri Rasmussen lost her life, the woman responsible had finally been convicted. For the Rasmussen family, the verdict brought accountability, but it could never erase the pain of losing a daughter, wife, and sister. The case became one of the most famous examples in American history of how modern DNA technology can solve crimes that once seemed impossible to prove. Yet one final chapter still remained: the sentencing, the parole hearings decades later, and the lasting impact this extraordinary would leave on cold case investigations across the United States. The guilty verdict marked the end of one of the longest and most extraordinary murder investigations in Los Angeles history. More than 23 years had passed since Sherri Rasmussen was killed inside her own home. For her family, justice had finally arrived, but it had come far too late. In May 2012, former LAPD detective Stephanie Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison for the first-degree murder of Sherri Rasmussen. During sentencing, the court heard emotional statements from Sherri's family. They spoke about the daughter, sister, and wife they had lost. They described decades of birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings where Sherri's absence was deeply felt. No sentence, they said, could ever replace what had been taken from them. One of the most emotional moments came as Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, reflected on the long road to justice. For more than 2 decades, he had repeatedly asked investigators to examine Stephanie Lazarus. He attended meetings. He wrote letters. He refused to stop asking questions, even when others believed the case would never be solved. Although he had finally seen the killer convicted, he had spent 23 years carrying the pain of knowing his daughter had been denied justice. Following the conviction, Los Angeles Police Department officials publicly acknowledged the significance of the case. The investigation became a powerful example of why unsolved murders should never be considered beyond resolution. Advances in forensic science had succeeded where earlier investigative methods could not. The preserved DNA evidence collected in 1986 ultimately became the key that exposed the killer. The case also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. Had investigators failed to properly store the biological evidence from the crime scene, modern DNA testing would never have been possible. What appeared to be insignificant evidence in 1986 eventually became the strongest proof presented in court. Years later, Stephanie Lazarus became eligible for parole consideration. During the hearings, members of Sherri Rasmussen's family opposed her release. They argued that Lazarus had never fully accepted responsibility for the murder. California officials carefully reviewed the circumstances surrounding the crime and her statements during parole proceedings. As a result, parole was denied. The decision meant Lazarus would remain in prison. For Sherri's family, it represented another important step toward accountability. Although nothing could undo the tragedy of February 24, 1986, they believed justice required that the sentence imposed by the court continue to be served. Today, the murder of Sherri Rasmussen remains one of America's most famous cold cases. The investigation is frequently studied by detectives, forensic experts, and criminal justice professionals because it highlights how scientific advances can solve crimes long after they occur. It also serves as a reminder that investigations should remain open to new evidence, even when years or decades have passed. The case changed the way many investigators viewed cold cases. Instead of seeing them as forgotten files, departments across the United States increasingly began reviewing unsolved murders using modern DNA technology. Many families who had nearly lost hope eventually received long-awaited answers because evidence had been preserved. For the Rasmussen family, however, the story was never simply about solving a case. It was about honoring Sherri's memory. She was more than a victim in a police file. She was a daughter, a wife, a sister, a friend whose life ended far too soon. More than 2 decades after her murder, the truth finally emerged, not through luck, but through determination, careful investigation, and advances in forensic science. The conviction of Stephanie Lazarus proved that time does not erase evidence. Sometimes justice moves slowly, but when investigators refuse to stop searching for the truth, even the oldest mysteries can finally be solved. The murder of Sherri Rasmussen remains one of the clearest examples that no matter how many years pass, the truth can still be uncovered.